Some of the most beloved creatures in cinema history were built from rubber cement, chicken wire, and someone's garage floor at 2 in the morning. The studios had budgets. These people had nerve. And for a generation of fans who grew up pressed against drive-in screens or huddled under blankets with a black and white television, the cheap stuff was the only stuff that ever really mattered. There is something that happens when a filmmaker has nothing left to hide behind. No budget means no safety net. You cannot buy your way out of a bad idea. You have to believe in it hard enough to make the audience believe too. And sometimes, against every reasonable expectation, it worked. These are the pictures critics dismissed and audiences adopted. They are still being watched tonight in somebody's living room while something more respectable sits forgotten on a shelf. There is a particular kind of desperation that produces the most fascinating failures in film history. When money runs out mid-production and someone else picks up the scraps, the result is rarely coherent and almost always unforgettable. Characters disappear between scenes without explanation. The story changes direction without warning. And buried in the wreckage you can usually find the original intention, glimmering through like a signal from a ship that went down in shallow water. The showman who trafficked in these pictures understood something the critics never did. Audiences at a drive-in did not demand perfection. They demanded something to react to. They wanted to lean out of a car window and argue about what they had just seen. A technically accomplished film that gave them nothing to talk about was a far greater failure than a cheap one that made them gasp or cover their eyes. The transaction was emotional, not aesthetic. Some of the most interesting films came out of Mexico, where a thriving domestic horror industry had developed completely outside the Hollywood system and had no interest in following its rules. Mexican horror pictures of the early 60s operated on their own internal logic, one where a masked professional wrestler was an entirely reasonable hero, where ancient sorcerers mixed it up with nightclub performers, and where the line between comedy and genuine dread was treated as optional. A Florida distributor with an instinct for the regional market dubbed many of these into English and scattered them across American late-night television, where they found an audience of insomniacs completely unprepared for what they were about to see. The Italian industry was doing something equally strange from a different direction. Italian Gothic horror had a visual sophistication wildly out of proportion with its budgets. Cinematographers who would later earn international reputations were learning their craft on candlelit dungeons and fog-soaked graveyards, squeezing something genuinely beautiful out of nothing at all. The plots were frequently borrowed from other sources without acknowledgement, the dubbing was often rough enough to be distracting, and the logic followed its own rules entirely. But the atmosphere was real. When one of these pictures creates dread, it creates genuine dread, and no amount of threadbare plotting can fully drain it away. Japan had its own parallel tradition, one that grew directly out of the experience of 1945 and channeled national anxieties into something spectacular. The giant monster pictures were technically ambitious in ways the American drive-in product rarely attempted. The miniature work was painstaking. The creature designs were genuinely inventive. And the best of these films had a melancholy underneath the spectacle that their reputation as campy monster movies tends to obscure. The creature is not just a problem to be solved. It is a force that cannot be reasoned with, and something in that refusal to be comforting stayed with audiences for decades. The American end of the budget spectrum had its own poets of cheapness. Working out of Florida, out of small California studios, out of rented locations and borrowed equipment, these filmmakers understood that spectacle is a state of mind. A man in a gorilla suit filmed only from the chest up because the production ran out of money before completing the legs is still a man in a gorilla suit. With the right framing and the right conviction from the performer inside the costume, it can still make an audience flinch. The key was commitment. You had to believe in the absurdity entirely, without blinking, and trust that the people watching would meet you halfway. The showmanship surrounding these pictures was often as inventive as anything on screen. Signed waivers. Spinning hypnotic spirals. Creature costumes showing up in unexpected public locations. Novelty bags handed out in theater lobbies for customers who felt unwell. These were not just marketing gimmicks. They were an acknowledgement that the experience of watching a monster picture extended well beyond the screen. The film was a shared ritual, and the promoter's job was to make that ritual feel significant. Hidden in the credits of pictures that critics wrote off as worthless were the early careers of people who would later reshape American cinema entirely. Cinematographers who shot Rubber Masks and Bargain Basement Dungeons in 1963 were behind the camera on landmark films by 1973. The cheap picture was frequently a school, and some of its graduates turned out to be extraordinary. The pictures that pushed horror into genuinely extreme territory did so not because their makers were trying to be theoretical about boundaries, but because transgressive content was the one thing a $30,000 film could offer that a studio production could not. A polished film had a reputation to protect. A picture made for pocket change had nothing to lose. And the discovery that a genuinely hungry audience existed for material the respectable industry refused to touch was one of the most commercially significant findings of the decade. It rewired horror permanently. The creatures that lurched across these screens were not sophisticated. But they were, in their odd way, sincere. Someone believed in them. Someone spent money they did not really have to bring them into existence. Someone climbed into a rubber suit in a rented soundstage and tried to be frightening. And for a particular kind of audience, that naked belief in the premise was more compelling than anything a polished production could manufacture. The drive-in is mostly gone now. The late-night creature feature as a programming institution has faded. But the films it sustained are still out there, and new generations keep finding them, with no nostalgic connection to the era that produced them, discovering these pictures through recommendation or accident or a particular curiosity about the outer edges of cinema. The rubber suit, it turns out, has a longer shelf life than anyone would have predicted. The people who made these pictures probably would not have believed it. But then, the people who made these pictures already believed in things most reasonable observers told them were impossible. That was the whole point. That was how a man with no budget, a creature costume, and 2 days on a rented location changed the rules of an entire genre. He did it because nobody told him he couldn't. And because the audience was waiting, at the drive-in, in the dark, ready to be surprised.